Okay, good morning all and welcome to today's edition of the CSP Summer School 2025. Today we are going to look at the contemporary African metaphysical views. And in today we are going to have two guest lecturers, Professor Jonathan Chimakonam and Dr. Arabia Ato. While Professor Jonathan Chimakonam is going to take us on Nmekoka, Relationality and African Metaphysics, Dr. Arabiato will take us on consolationism and predeterministic historicity. So with that much ado, I know Professor Jonathan is here with us. I will call on Professor Jonathan to take us on the first lecture. It will interest us to know that Professor Jonathan Chimakonam is a professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy, University of Pretoria, South Africa, and is going to take us for 45 minutes. This will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. Thank you and welcome to our today's session. Please, Professor Jonathan, it's your time.
Thank you very much. The moderator, let me share my slides so that you'll be able to follow me. Okay, can you see my slides, please?
Yes, we can see the slides, Prof.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Moderator, and welcome to my talk today, which will be on relational field metaphysics. Give me a moment, please. Okay, so to start, we know the idea of metaphysics, the branch of philosophy that studies the foundational principles of reality, and that it has two main aspects, cosmology and ontology. Cosmology dealing with the study of the origin and development of the universe, and ontology dealing with the nature of beings, that is the entities in the universe itself. So when we talk about African metaphysics, we're also talking about African perspectives to this very branch of philosophy, including cosmology and ontology. Interestingly, many African philosophers agree that there is a paucity of research work on the subject of African metaphysics, and I agree. Not in the sense that people haven't written anything at all. Of course, people have written a lot on African metaphysics, but mainly focusing on identifying and discussing, singling out some themes in African metaphysics and discussing it, such as time, death, life, afterlife, and so on and so forth. But also, there have been some African thinkers that have been able to weave some theories on one aspect of African metaphysics, notably African ontology. And in that rank, we can mention a host of scholars, especially from Southern and Eastern Africa, that have articulated Ubuntu ontology. And we can also mention other scholars in recent memory, like Pantaleon Urebu, who developed Owa ontology, Innocent Asuzu, who developed Igbo and Danda ontology, Chris Ijoma, who developed the relational ontology, and Adagada, his consolationist theory, and Arabiato, who will speak after myself, and his predeterministic historicity. And myself, who in a work I co-authored in 2021, developed Nmekoka metaphysics, okay, really being one of the foremost theories that attempts to accommodate both cosmology and ontology. And in a 2024 publication, I embellished that theory further. And that would be the focus of today's lecture, while at the same time touching on other ideas that people have contributed. Okay, so relational field dynamics as a key idea in African philosophical thinking generally. Of course, you may have also had people using cognate concepts in their writings, whether in epistemology or political philosophy or in ethics. Concepts such as relational, relationship, relationality, in different forms to characterize or qualify various ideas in African thinking. But the question is, what does a relational approach to African thinking or to thinking, what does it entail? In recent times, we have also seen scholars in the Western tradition calling conferences and using these qualifiers and writing a number of things using this qualifier, relational and all, and as the case may be. What does it entail, really? And why is it philosophical and African at the same time? These are two important questions that I think our lecture today will shed light on as we proceed. But before we do that, let us do some foundational exercise, all right? The linguistic basis of the relational field metaphysics. What is it? Of course, we know that the linguistic basis of Western philosophy, of course, when we trace it down to the Milesians and to Aristotle himself, who in his Organon collection of logical works and his metaphysical works, provided and developed the basis for Western philosophical tradition. Okay, we see the foundational concept of logos, okay, which translates to word or reason discourse in Aristotle's definition, appropriated in modern time by the likes of Francis Bacon, who inaugurated the inductive scientific method, and René Descartes, who systematized the rational method in his discourses on method and meditations, as the case may be. All of which crystallized to form the basis of foundation of modernity as we know it today, and which continues to drive discourse in different disciplines and different fields. However, scholars, and eminent ones for that matter, have all criticized the bivalent structure of this tradition and how it creates a divisive structure of interpreting and explaining the world and reality as may be, as the case may be. Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, for example, argued that the logos-driven foundation to philosophical discourse has led to what he calls logocentrism, which is a system of marginality that shuns, some discourses on some people, some cultures to the margins, while centralizing the perspective of one cultural tradition, which for him should be discarded and should be called out. And Michel Foucault, another French philosopher, followed in this regard to say that this over extreme and marginal focus on logos has also led to logophilia, the love for such marginality and divisiveness in the world intellectual space, and criticizes as such. And Sama Amin, the Egyptian thinker, in his work of 1989, translated eventually to English a few years later, calls out Eurocentrism as another modern ramification of this marginality in world knowledge system. And so you see that logos, despite all of its very interesting and positive contributions and importance, such as precision, clarity, consistency, avoidance of contradiction, also has immense weakness that halves the world's epistemic formation residualizing one and highlighting one aspect, thereby introducing so much conflict and injustice in the world epistemic corpora. And so this necessitates and informs, as scholars have actually called for such a new conceptual foundation. Without success, it's compelled me to go to work, and in 2018, I published a work where, in tapping into the linguistic resources in African languages, I was able to arrive at the concept of Oku, derived from the Igbo language. Oku meaning the raw materials from which words are formed. In Igbo language, when we talk about words, we translate words as mkpụrụ okwu, okay, fruits of Oku, fruits of Oku. So Oku really is not word, just like logos translate to word. Oku does not translate to word. It is formless. It is like a clay out of which you can form any words that you want. And as such, it does not have this sort of ethnocentric commitment that logos brings to the table to shape discourse in ways that privilege one and places the other at severe disadvantage. And in 2013, I further developed this, arriving at the concept of okucentricity, not an okucentrism, but okucentricity, that highlights complementarity rather than differentiation, as I will show momentarily. It's important that I provide this conceptual basis to this discourse to see how the relational field metaphysics emerges and how it departs from the logos-driven discourse. So this conceptual departure from logos to Oku is probably best captured by Boris Bogoslovsky, a Russian-American logician who, in appropriating his ideas, we may say that in the linguistic structure of logos, the tendency there is a tendency to distinguish, differentiate, isolate, describe as exhaustively as possible, define perfectly, and establish once and for all the eternal pattern of our universe. Okay, this structure is undergirded by the two-value logic and driven by the bivalent metaphysical structure of thoughts. Whereas in Oku, we could say that there is a tendency to interrelate, to connect, all right, and to explore the interdependent, complementary nature of things, ways that unite different elements of our experiences in the world. Okay, so these are the two conceptual difference between logos-driven discourse and Oku-driven discourse. Now, in exploring what is available in extant literature on African metaphysical, logical, epistemic thinking, I was able to arrive at three central concepts in African thoughts. Okay, by picking at the ideas developed by other African thinkers. For example, Leopold Senghor, in his logical and metaphysical essays of 1956 and 1962, respectively, developed his semantic theory of dynamic reasoning, as he calls it, to refer to the fluidity of reasoning in African thought that can admit of opposites as separate contexts. So here we see the importance and centrality of context in African thinking, further highlighted by Meira Hebgar, the Cameroonian philosopher and logician and sociologist, who in his essay of 1958 demonstrated that somebody's calling me, sorry. Okay, so argues that some aspects of thoughts in African life world presuppose a semantic theory broader than the Aristotelian tradition, one that can capture the relevance of context. Once again, you see another African scholar homing in on the value and relevance of context in African philosophical thinking. And then fast forward to 2004 and 2013, 2020, you see Innocent Assos of the Calabar School develops a semantic theory that he calls complementary logic, where above all else, he describes the complementary possibility of opposite realities. So here again, we see another concept, complementarity. And Ijoma, as well as Pantolini again, developing in his Ijoma's semantic theory called harmonious monism, giving us another important concept, where he describes the relational possibility of opposite realities. Here again, we see the third important concept, relationality, relationship, relation, as the case may be. So in my research, as I explored diverse literature, I see that different African scholars have used cognate terms, like harmony and all kinds of another related concepts to, once again, approximate these three key concepts that these people have given to us. And in further studies, I realized that even other concepts that are, somewhat different from these three concepts can, in different ways, be related to these three concepts. So this gave me the warrant to proclaim these three concepts: context, relation, and complementarity as central in the African thought. So some African metaphysical thinkers like E. A. Rush and K.C. Anyanwu, and in 1981, C.B. Okolo 1998, have pointed to the notion of relationship as well as cardinal to the African metaphysical thinking. Pantolini also discusses this notion as belongingness. All right, these are cognates, but the discussion all point to the same. So from these three concepts, we progress to formulating them into metaphysical principles. All right, so far so good. We've moved from the linguistic basis of Hupu to the central concepts of context, relationship, complementarity, and to the formation of the metaphysical principles for African thought. All right, the first one being relationality, from the concept of relational relationship, stating that variables necessarily interrelate irrespective of their unique contexts, all things considered, because no variable is an ego solus. And contextuality, stating that every relationship between variables occurs in a specific context and can only be understood within that context because context obsesses facts. And complementarity, stating that seemingly opposed variables can have a relationship of complementation rather than mere contradiction. In other words, this principle is saying that contradiction is a firm positive relationship, but it is not the end of relationship. Okay, it's always possible to negotiate contradiction and arrive at a higher level of a relationship called complementarity. Now, from these principles, we can see the conceptual, logical, and methodological departure that's from logos-driven approach to metaphysics to an Opu-driven approach. So before you there, we present a mock chart there where under Western metaphysics you see logos at the foundation, under African metaphysics you see Opu. Then the logic that derives this one bivalent is bivalent in structure, the other one is trivalent in structure, and the method, whether it's analytic, phenomenological, what have you, are all pursuing differentiation, distinction, isolation, describing to perfection the eternal pattern of things. And over there, you see going beyond that to focus more on constructing and looking at relational qualities, of things, which we will make more obvious as we progress in this discussion. So the outcome is, on the one hand, substance metaphysics, and on the other hand, relational field metaphysics. So that next time when we hear this concept relational, and of which many people who employ it really don't bother to go into extensive linguistic, a discussion of the concept and seeing and showing how they become instrumentalized in terms of methodology and applications. So between substance metaphysics and relational field metaphysics, metaphorically, we can describe these two approaches with the image you have before you there. All right. In substance metaphysics approach, what do we do? The Aristotle and Plato's and of this world and modern metaphysicians that follow that approach, what do? Literally, they follow the injunction of Francis Bacon that we should constrain nature, we should constrain matter, we should constrain reality, to a rack and compel it to bear witness against itself. All right. But relational field metaphysics does not do that. What it does is to lure nature, lure matter, lure reality into relationships and then tickle them, to speak to us rather than torturing them to bear witness against themselves. And this is a very important idea to keep in mind as we progress to discussing relational field metaphysics. So in sum, before we move on, the relational field metaphysics claims that being can better be assessed through its relationships. What that means is that instead of studying an entity, okay, you study the relationships that entity is involved in, or that bring that entity into existence to start with. I'll get back to that. Unlike the substance metaphysics approach, which attempts to entrap being in a rack and then compel it to bear witness against itself. This is what Bacon asked us to do when he inaugurated his scientific based methodology of induction and experimentation. But there is a very little being can say when constrained or even tortured, in the words of Carolyn Merchant, in a rack to bear witness against itself. Being unfolds and manifests its attributes in relationship. Being exposes itself in relationship. Dormancy is the undoing of being. It silences being, and that is why when, from the perspective of relational field metaphysics and Nmekoka metaphysics to be specific, which I'll get to, when we look at an entity, we are not looking at an object, we are looking at relationship, a mass of relationship, various entities and realities that came into relationship to form that entity as it presents itself to us. So in studying that entity, we are looking beyond what stands before us and focusing on the various relationships that formed it. So being is most truthfully and vividly loquacious on its own terms, not when it is tortured or constrained in a rack. So towards the relational field metaphysics, what is relational field metaphysics? What is relationality when instrumentalized or transformed into a methodology? So a relational field metaphysics is an umbrella term for metaphysical theories that prioritize the study of relationship, context of relationship, and the transformational potential of relationship. B, African culture inspired and developed from a common relational thread in various African worldviews, all right? And C, centralize the concepts of relationship, context, and complementation in their frameworks. D, and these theories are grounded in, the ground is the assumptions in a truth glut type of three-valued logic, like the system of harmonious monism Ijoma developed, or complementary logic that Asusu developed, or the Zumezu variants that I developed. With all this foundation given, we ask ourselves, there are people, African scholars who are employing the concept of relationality. There are Western philosophers who are now beginning to employ it, and even some of them striving to indigenize it to make it sound Western. But most of these people ignore the logical implication of relationality, because once you evoke that concept, you are dabbling into a terrain that may potentially violate some of the canonical laws that underlie the stringent bivalent system that holds the modern structure together. And so those of us in the Calabar School have, across 3 different generations, been working on this, and I've tried to systematize what they have been doing. For example, the Calabar School has a working thesis, the approach of the Calabar School, the ideological structure, which is relational and follows all the structure, that logical, methodological structure that I've discussed and explained before now. The first of these 4 components of its ideological structure is what is called the working thesis. The working thesis of the Calabar School stipulates that understanding the nature of relationship that variables can engage in, the context of those relationships, are key to understanding reality, the conflictual problem that confront the universe, and the complementary ways that such problems could be resolved. And the problem for Calabar School is that the main problem of the 21st century is what they call the problem of borderlines, written as 2 separate words, border and lines, okay, which means which is stated as saying that there is an unbridgeable gap between opposites. All right, and the challenge is to find the root cause of this problem. Ijoma and Asuzu have told us that we can trace the root cause of the borderline problem to the bivalent logic that Aristotle formalized or systematized in the 3rd century BCE. And then that leads us to the 2 main questions that inform the philosophical developments and ideas from the Calabar School. The first one being the first question is, does difference amount to inferiority? And the second question is, are opposites irreconcilable? All right, these 2 questions herald and inform the ideas that members of Calabar School across 3 different generations, have been putting out there in philosophical works. Now we can see the works that they have produced, the books across different generations, and all that. And then we have 3 main journals, the Philosophia Theoretica, Arumaroka, and the new journal, Resumes the Logic. We continue to invite and submissions for those who are interested in having the ideas and perspectives of African philosophy. Different branches of African philosophy can make submission to any of these journals. And so thus being for us in a relational sense is relationship. Everything is something only in a relationship. Even nothing is something because of relationship. Existence, therefore, is a relationship. Reality is a network, and being serves a missing link in it. Without relationship, there is no becoming, and hence no being. These are some of the ideas that I have tried to pull from the works of some African thinkers. From the cosmological point of view, the study of the nature of the universe is development, as case may be for us, is something that focuses on simple and complex relationships of reality. And it has 3 approaches, okay? And this was developed in a work I co-authored in 2021. First approach to understanding the nature and development of universe is what we call Mpuwa, all right? Before we can understand the world as it is, the universe, we've got to perceive it. When we perceive it, we have to describe it. We have to express it, okay? As we have perceived it, as we have imagined it, as we have conceptualized it, as the case may be. But we don't stop there. We have to go beyond that to interpret, okay, the world as we have imagined, perceived, or conceptualized it. And then in doing this, we have to bear in mind, and this is the third one, Arumaroka, the understanding that the universe is not a single object, but a mass of relationships. All right. We have heard the theory of evolution say that the universe emerged out of a certain big bang explosion of gaseous whatever. And creationism telling us about how some divine entity created the world, as the case may be. All right. From our own perspective, cosmological idea concerning this, the universe emerged from a complex relationship of individual entities. Now, how did these unique singular individual entities emerge is still a subject of further debate in the Calabar School. In terms of cosmology, Nmekoka, which is what we use, translation of relationality, the Nmekoka ontology gives us three categories of being and three categories of existence and 4 classes of being. But before then, how did we arrive this? We have to go down to the work that Emmanuel Lede conducted, published in 1985, where he worked with 2 hypotheses as to this, to arriving at what could be the concept of being from an African point of view. So he has 2 hypotheses, the Onye hypothesis and the Ife hypothesis. But he finally settled with Ife hypothesis because for him it's closely approximates the idea of being in the English language and other languages as well. So to perfect that, he adds verb to be, ede, to arrive at ifede as being. And this is from his Igbo language, of course. And so borrowing that, we were able to create the analytics of Nmekoka ontology, consisting of 3 categories of existence, under which we have 4 classes of being. And the categories of existence, as you can see there, include 1, Ifedi, all right, Ife Nkiti and Ife Izugbe. Okay, in terms of Ifedi, has 2 aspects, Ifeowa, okay, the things that exist in the world, and Ifemwa, the things that exist in the mind, imaginary beings. Okay, then Ifeowa also has 2 aspects, Ifezi, the concrete beings, and Ifeno, the abstract beings. Okay, and then Ife Nkiti is a different category of existence, where the entities under this category of existence are entities that we in this spatio-temporal world cannot perceive, imagine, or even conceptualize. Okay, but we have these ideas vividly as it is. I try to translate this as nothingness, but not in the sense of absence, okay, but it properly in the sense of absent presence, okay? It's a category of existence other than different from the category of Ifedi. And it's also different from the category of Ifizugbe. Category of Ifizugbe is where we can have ideas in different classes of being, formed together, all right? Even though, for example, Enyin Nono, all right, Enyin Nono means elephant bird. There's nothing like elephant bird. Elephant and bird match together. But this belongs to the category of Ifizugbe, where we compound, where we complement, where ideas belonging to different classes of being could actually complement. And this will make logical sense when we proceed further to discuss the modes and the modes of existence. But before then, let us talk about motions and their drivers. Okay, when we talk about relational field metaphysics, and we are talking of classes of beings and categories of existence, we understand that for things to come into existence, different beings have to come into relationship to produce new beings or new entities as what have you. That movement, that's a movement, and it is what we describe as motions. Asuzu identified two important motions that account for the movement of beings, different classes of beings and entities, to bring other things into existence. And he describes them as the conjunctive and disjunctive motions. Okay? As I continue to look at my time. Adagad also talks about evolutionary motion in his treatise on constellation philosophy. Among concrete realities, some are animate while others are inanimate, and these are all capable of getting into these motions to move around and recreate and reorganize existence, as Ede describes them as Ifemwe London, Ifemwe Indo, respectively. Now, when an entity reaches the threshold of animation, and this is the idea of Adagada, it becomes an animate, active being. Again, it is motion, conjunctive motion, that is responsible for such movement. So animate, active beings are capable of motion, while inactive ones are targets of conjunctive and disjunctive motions, respectively. So while the instinct of self-sufficiency instigates the conjunctive motion in entities, when entities feel insufficient and they want to upgrade or better themselves, they look for ways of relating with other entities that can make them complete, and that is driven again by the instinct of self-insufficiency that instigates conjunctive motion, while self-preservation instigates disjunctive motion. One entities want to protect themselves from annihilation, assimilation from other entities, and they pull away disjunctive motion. So all these motion and their drivers speak to the dynamism, the relational dynamism of African metaphysics. And as a result, attention has to be focused on discussing and unpacking the concept of relationship, remember, as one of the three central concepts of African thought. And a number of scholars have talked about relationship and the types there are in African thought. Some identify two, like Thaddeus Mayers identified the relationship of identity and solidarity, goodwill, and as he describes it. But in my own research, I have identified 4 types of relationship. The first one being difference, thinking of oneself as an I, being in itself but not against others. The second type of relationship, solidarity, thinking of oneself as a we, being for others and potentially against oneself. Okay? And the third one, contradiction, thinking of oneself as an opposite, being against others. And finally, creative struggle or complementation, thinking of oneself with others, being with others. All right, so in these 4 types of relationship, 2 of them, difference and contradiction, are driven by disjunctive motion, while solidarity and creative struggle are driven by conjunctive motion, respectively. And this describes how entities relate. Now, this brings us again to the modes that I mentioned that I was going to come back to, the contextual mode and the complementary mode. All right, remember, context, complementation, and relationship are the 3 central concepts in African thought. And so the contextual modes are modes where entities, individual entities, are on their own, all right, maintaining their identity, asserting their identity and difference from other entities. These are contextual modes, all right? But when they come together, negotiate contradiction, they arrive at a complementary mode where they could complement, for example, Aristotle's idea of future contingent propositions, propositions that are yet to occur, that will occur in the future, and how do we determine their values as of today? Okay, we can do that firmly in the complementary mode. from where they can again enter disjunctive motions and break away down to contextual modes when that future time emerges and one of them occurs and the other fails to occur, as the case may be. Perhaps this is also what can enable us, this type of logical thinking can enable us explain the dynamics of quantum mechanics, all right? Where since the 1930s till today, there have been a great number of logicians, mathematicians, and physicists attempting to explain how the dynamics of quantum theory actually works, and leading to the development of all kinds of three-valued logic to explain that, when, as soon as they all agreed that the two-valued logic that underlies the Aristotle's metaphysics and the old mechanics proves inadequate at axiomatizing on the statements of quantum physics. All right. And we saw the likes of the Polish logician Jan Lukasiewicz developing his three-value logic. We saw Beckhoff and von Neumann in 1936 publishing their own. And we see the logicians, Russian logicians, A.D. Bogfa and Boris Borovsky that I mentioned earlier, developing theirs. And a host of American logicians, Stephen Klein, Hans Reichenbach in 1944, Hilary Putnam, all of them developing and strengthening different other versions that were existing to be able to account for this, and really not succeeding. But maybe this helps us to accommodate that, the modes from contextual to complementary, the relational dynamics of African metaphysics and logic, showing how particles and waves, which are opposites and deemed irreconcilable, but experimentally proved to be reconcilable in the wave-particle duality, okay, and all kinds of experiments that they conduct in physics that continue to confirm this, but we continue to lack the type of logic that can axiomatize it. And so, with all this, we see, again, the importance of context alongside relationship and and complementation, as we mentioned earlier. So logically, the principle of context dependence of value is evoked to demonstrate how context can play a fundamental role in the evaluation of propositions, right? And the principle is stated as credible value judgments are based on context because context upsets facts. Okay, take for example, you could stand on a hill and then you're looking down, let's say 10 miles ahead, and you see something greenish, and because there are trees around, you conclude that that's another tree. But someone standing a few yards away, you could actually see that this is a tarpaulin, green tarpaulin, and not a tree. Context obsesses facts. That is what our principle of contextuality stipulates, which we mentioned earlier. So what we call truth, for example, may not always depend on the collection of facts which a proposition asserts, but rather on the context in which that proposition is asserted. And this is different from Frege's second fundamental principle, which is the principle of context of a proposition, stated thus: never to ask for the meaning of a word in isolation, but only in the context of a proposition. The difference between this is that in Frege's words are in the context of a proposition, but in our own context dependence of value, propositions themselves are in the context, as the case may be. So methodologically, as I bid to wrap it up to afford us enough time for discussion, what you see before you is diagrammatic representation of a methodology and methodologies that could be deemed relational, okay, in structure. So on top of this structure, you see relationship, okay, driving. Beneath, you see simple and complex relationships, all right? And we are talking about ontological similarities, entities that are similar, even though, mildly, that mostly similar. And this side, you see entities that are different, totally. And these are the categories of existence, the ontologies, the entities involved in those things. And then you come down to the actual type of relationship that they can engage in simple variables, that can engage in, different type of relationship we have already mentioned, and through conjunctive motions, for example, through solidarity. And then you see simple but significantly different realities engaging through contextuality, marking they are different from one another, through disjunctive motions, separating from one another, and relationship of differentiation eventually is arrived at. And then you have contradiction, right? Negotiated to create relationship of complementarity through conjunctive motion, arriving at creative struggle. This type of relationship is the best way. It is creative because it produces these new ideas. It is a struggle because it's conflictual. We are talking about entities that have a significant difference and interest if we are talking of human beings coming into a relationship. And but contradiction is not the end of relationship in this regard. It can always be negotiated to arrive at creative struggle. So, in sum, relational field metaphysics differs remarkably from substance-based metaphysics in the sense, as we mentioned earlier, of its propensity to study relationship, the context of those relationships, and the complementary potential of those relationships. To look at entities not as objects, but as an amalgam. Yes, and
please.
yes. So I've actually come to the end of my lecture. Thank you
Please, Prof,
very
can you hear
much.
me? Yes.
Let us
Please, Prof, your time is over. Sorry.
Yeah, the moderator, you're breaking off, but I am done. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof, for that interesting lecture. So we've come to the end of that presentation.
Hi, I think I'll take over from here. So thank you very much, Prof, for your lecture. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Very quickly, if you have questions, just use the hands up emoji, and then I'll call on you to ask your question, or you could write your question on the chat box. But whilst we are still thinking about our various questions, I have a question, and I think I'm privileged to be the new moderator now, so I can ask my question. You mentioned imaginary beings as beings that are captured by your Nmekoka metaphysics. But my question is simple. How is this possible? How are imaginary beings actual beings in the world? Or are they not actual beings in the world? If they are not actual beings in the world, then how are they beings in your metaphysics? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. In that diagram, you would see the three categories of existence: Ifede, Ifenkiti, and Ifizube. Okay, these are categories of existence, not categories of beings, but more like states of existence. Then we have four classes of beings. These are beings that we can find under possibly under these three broad categories of being. All right. So if a more imaginary beings happen to, alongside Ifowa, be the two classes of being that we can find under Ifedi. All right. And this is because even though Ifemwa is an imaginary being, it is conjured, it is imagined really from the ideas of beings that we have in the world. Okay. So, but they exist as imaginary beings, not as beings in the world, because they are not extended as such. For example, I gave an example of elephant bird. Okay, now we know of elephant as an extended.
Well, okay, William, you can ask a question.
Thank you very much, Professor To and Professor Chimakonam. I enjoyed your presentation. It's refreshing to hear something entirely different from the system of metaphysics that we have been trained to know of. So thank you very much for that perspective. My question has to do with the fundamental nature of the relations that you are trying to map. What is the relation of a stone to stone? What is the relation of a stone to a cat? What is the relation of a stone to human or human to stone? Is it reflexive? Is it symmetrical? Is it asymmetrical? Is it transitive? What is the nature of those relations? And if you go back to the question of the nature of those relations, it appears then that there is something about reality A and reality B, which actually defines the sort of relation they enter into. And this seems to be, so it seems to take us a step back and suppose that perhaps before we address the question of how A and B relates, we should discuss, or we should settle the question of what is it that makes A and what makes B B, so that they enter into this particular sort of relationship and not that particular sort of relationship. So I wanted to hear your comment on the nature of relations.
Okay, thank you very much, William, for the interesting question that you have asked. Let me use the example that you mentioned. You said, what's the relationship of a stone to a cat, for example, or a stone to a human being, or a stone to a stone? Okay, so if you look at the my explanation from the beginning, I'm trying to see if I can get my slides up again, but I think it's going to take time. So let me just go for it. How do stones form? Okay. The geological processes that lead to the formation of rocks, for example, involves complex chemical interaction of various materials that eventually lead to the formation of a stone. So when you are looking at a stone from substance metaphysical point of view, you're looking at an object. But when you are studying a stone from a relational field metaphysics, you are going beyond that. You are considering all kinds of entities that come together to form the stone, the complex chemical substances that come together to form the stone. All right. And then even the stone itself is resting on something. Okay, so the stone is again further in relationship with the entity it's resting on. Okay, and that entity is resting on is made up of all kinds of other entities that form a relationship. Okay, and then a cat comes along well-fed and happy, wants to play, tosses around the stone, is in a relationship with that stone. And then look at the 4 types of relationship that I define. I'm not talking about the asymmetrical and the transitive, all kinds of other relationship that have been mapped and identified in linguistics and logic and what have you. I am talking about the 4 types of relationship that metaphysical 4 types of relationship that I have identified. Now, a cat may frolic around with a stone, okay, in a relationship of solidarity. Both of them are happy. But then when you pick up a stone, when another agent of relationship picks up a stone and hits a cat, okay, a cat is still in a relationship with that stone, but not that of solidarity anymore, but that of contradiction. Okay. Now, when a cat that is playing with a stone suddenly feels that this stone is so harsh and has brushed across his face and decides to move away from the stone, it is still in relationship with that stone, but this time around, relationship of difference. Okay. When, for example, you as a human being gathers stones, and you want to build with it, form a concrete, and build something, you are in a relationship of creative struggle. Okay. It is not a smooth sailing thing for you to gather stones, mix them up, pour as a concrete and all that. It is a critical and creative relationship. Okay. And that is also what happens with every entity in the universe. The universe itself is a mass of relationship of various chemicals, entities, individuals, and what have you. So there is not such a thing that we can point at and say that's the universe. No, but what we see as a universe is a mass of relationship of all kinds of things, including us, that are perceiving and studying that universe. So that is why we say that relationship being is relationship. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Jonathan. I think there are some questions on the chat box. First from Ivan. He does say the second part of the question is what should be of interest, but I think it's best to read the whole question to give you the proper context.
Okay.
All right, so it says, it is my question is, are you familiar with relational quantum mechanics? It is an interpretation of quantum mechanics that suggests that we could best understand what we observe in the quantum level through a relational lens. I wonder if we can go back and interpret other knowledge theories based in the Western empirical logos tradition in this relational context. Would this radically rewrite how we understand the world? And what new insights or improvements on science and society would this approach have? All right, that's the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Going back to interpret Newtonian physics or classical physics in light of relational dynamics will not go as you think it will go, because fundamentally Newtonian physics, classical physics, rests on the traditional laws of thoughts, identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. Okay, these are the laws that axiomatize it. Why? Because it is directed, geared at obtaining clarity, precision, consistency, and avoidance of contradiction. These are very important attributes, okay, that enable us to make sense of the world as it has been ordered, patterned. All right. Now, but with quantum mechanics, we see a situation where the tenet of non-contradiction can easily be violated, requiring different types of logical laws and logical system to axiomatize it. And this has led logicians to finding that type of logic that can enable us make sense of it. You see, when we evoke the concept of relational, when we use that concept, we are ultimately matching beyond the what the classical logic can explain. Because we are all of a sudden, for example, saying that opposites may not contradict. Okay, and this will be rebuffed by classical law of thought. Okay, the problem is, especially in mainframe of philosophy today, when people evoke that concept, they again continue to arrive at conclusions and underlie the arguments they are making using logic, two-value logic, without knowing that they've since crossed over and all that. So if you want to use the relational dynamics to go and map statements of classical thoughts, you will again run into contradictions. Okay, it doesn't mean that the statements of quantum physics and similar complementary relational inferences, future contingent propositions, it doesn't mean that they cannot be explained just with a different set of laws, a different set of logic, and what have you, and which is what I have tried to explain in the discussion and description of this relational field metaphysics. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan, for that answer. Ivan, if you're not satisfied, you can write up a follow-up, and if we have time, we can go through it. So I'll go to the next question on the chat box from William Love. They say, could you please help to understand the role or importance of substance in such a relational field metaphysics? For instance, does the Ifedi make a dualistic claim about substance? Or if not, can you please help clarify how it avoids doing so when differentiating between the realms of the mind and the realms of the physical?
Okay, thank you very much. To understand the workings of the relational field metaphysics, it's important that we also understand the centrality of the three concepts as I began with, all right? And in understanding that, it's also important that we are able to link them up properly with the four types of relationships and what inspires those four types of those relationships and the motions that drive them, and then the modes, okay, from the contextual to the complementary as driven by the conjunctive motion, and from complementary back to contextual again as driven by the disjunctive motion. Okay, so with all of these, it will be easy to understand that an entity still exists as an entity, a substance, or what have you, but not just like a static object, but as a relational mass. In other words, any given entity could, again, be broken down to several other entities that come together to form it. Okay, following the disjunctive and the conjunctive motions, respectively. Okay, in that sense, we may begin to understand that the focus of analysis, methodologically and otherwise, from the relational field perspective, is in the nature of relationships, okay, that an entity is involved in, could get involved in, the context of those relationships, and the complementary potential of those relationships. All right? Unlike in substance metaphysics, when we identify a thing following the law of identity, and then we begin to study that entity, its expressions, and the other entities that it aligns with, are the ones that it does not align with, that spring forth contradiction, the ones that it could go with, and the ones that would have to make way when it is there, okay, giving us the idea of a law of excluded middle. Okay, in relational field metaphysics, we're not saying that these laws are invalid. No, we are saying that they are inadequate. Okay, in other words, trivalence becomes an improvement on bivalence, not a rejection of bivalence. All right, so there is a logical underpinning to this whole thing, which I mentioned skeletally, but Izumezu and the references are there. You could go and understand the logic that explains this better. It's still work in progress anyways, but hope I understood your question and I have addressed it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan. The next question is from Iba Dube, and she says, is there a possibility of true relationality between beings and non-beings?
Okay, so first and foremost, we have to get our minds wrapped around the idea of non-beings, all right? Because this is a concept that squarely fits into the bivalent structure, the substance metaphysics, okay? In the Nmekoka metaphysics, we identify three categories of existence, which are like states of existence, and then the four classes of beings, okay? Your idea of non-being might fall into the category of ifenkiti, okay? Which translates as nothingness, but not nothingness in the sense of nothing, but nothingness in the sense of absent presence. Okay. And so in that regard, there is a relationship because we get to know of Ifewa, okay, when we put it in relation to Ifemo, okay. So Ifewa tells us more, we get to know more about Ifemo from our knowledge of Ifewa. There is a relationship. And this relationship, there's no limit to all kind of relationship that can be drawn or established between all kinds of entities, okay, including nothingness. If we try to put non-being into the category of nothingness, our idea and knowledge of the world that is contributes to our own knowledge of the idea of the world that is not, as the case may be. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. I think we have about two more questions. One question and one follow-up. But please permit me to abuse my privilege as a moderator to ask you this quick question. Do you think the relationship between non-being and being could possibly be that non-being helps conscious entities determine the borders of metaphysics itself? In other words, it is non-beings that help us to know what being is and demarcates being from nothingness in that way. I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, so recall that my acknowledgement of non-being and trying to put it under the category of nothingness is to aid us to make sense of what we are saying, all right? Because my idea of that category of nothingness, that category of ifenkete, is not the idea of absence. It's not a privation. It's not a category of being that does not exist, but a category of being that is absent. Okay, absent presence. Okay, this being exists in this category, but we cannot imagine it. This nature, we cannot perceive it. We cannot even conceptualize its nature because of our spatio-temporal limitations. And if you choose to describe what is in that category as non-being, then that's fine if it enables you to make sense of the concepts we're grappling with and all that. And in a relational sense, yes, it enables us to make sure, absence enables us to make sense of presence in that regard. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. So last two questions. First from Francis, who says, is there any possibility of another degree of relationship after or perhaps beyond complementarity? Do you suppose that it's a necessity?
Okay, so yeah, there's always a possibility, but you have to frame it, okay? You frame it, ground it properly in some logical laws that will make it enable it make sense to people. Okay, there's always a possibility. I grant that there's such a possibility, but I haven't framed it. All right, so maybe you can frame it and explain it to us. Okay, but in my thinking as at now, I think creative struggle seems to adequately encompass the ideas, the rudimentary ideas that I was working with, that those before me worked with, that the works of those that I built upon, what it was like. And all these things traces down to African cultural worldview. Wherever culture that you come from in Africa or you're familiar with in Africa, you run across these rudimentary ideas. Recall how, having challenged the status of Oku, of Logos, and moved to find another residual index, primordial index for thought, that does not have the same challenges as Logos. And coming from there to trace conceptual framings in the literature by African scholars, arriving at three of them that could again stand as coordinates to many of the other concepts that others have been using, framing metaphysical principles from them, out of which additional laws of thought have been framed in a logic, which I did not bring into the main frame of discussion today, that inspire the Nmekoka metaphysics that I and some other people are working on, and which can also explain other metaphysical theories other African philosophers are working on, and the methodologies that, especially the relational variants that is being promoted these days. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. I think there's one more question here from William, which is a follow-up. He says that he begs to differ. Reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity are not only about logic and linguistics. The relation of beings that populate the world are not in exact same relationship. The relation of human to human is not and cannot be the same as the relation of non-human to non-human. While the relation of humans may be one of equality, that of humans to non-humans is not of equality. But right there, we are already speaking of the reflexivity, our reflexivity of the relations. It is not possible to evade the question of the nature of these relations or confine that to logical linguistics. Reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity, etc., are as fundamental to any metaphysics as they are to logic. If the relation of stone to cat is not as the relation of man to man, we are forced to deal with what makes those relations different. This goes to the nature of the relations itself. So perhaps you can respond to that.
Well, it's a good thing that we agree. In philosophy, disagreement is a good thing. So that's fine, but at no point did I say that these classes of relationships are strictly the concern of logic, and I never said that. I mentioned logic, I mentioned linguistics as areas where these types of relationships are studied. I didn't say that they are limited to those areas, okay? And secondly, it's also important for us to understand the influence that our education and learning will have on us. All right. So that is why most times when you're speaking from the point of view of your learning, your education, things that you're familiar with, things that you are an authority in. Okay. And sometimes it may be difficult for us to acknowledge or even grant that different point of view, different perspectives could be possible, all right, without being wrong at the same time. And these are the challenge of education itself, because it shapes us, it influences us, it molds us. And it could be difficult to take a step back out of all this. All that you have said are not in contradiction with what I'm saying. Okay, when you consider the relationship of a human being and a stone, and when you are looking at a human being as a human being, the way we see it as a social being, as a cultural being, as a political being, and you're looking at a stone as an inanimate object, all right? It is difficult when you wear that mindset to understand that there may be more between a human being and a stone. There are very similar chemical compositions in human being and in stone as well. And when human beings die, they dissolve into sand, into dust, things that, again, participate in the formation of some different kinds of rock sediments and what have you. Okay, and so there are very subtle, deeper, connections between everything in the universe are connected to everything else. And that is why Asuzu says that being is that on account of which anything that exists is a missing link of reality. And the differences we see amongst entities in the universe are really not as subtle as we think they are. Okay, there are many lines of connections and many various types of relationship that we can imagine or conceptualize to explain some of these intricate mazes that characterize existence. Thank you, all the same, for the wonderful comment.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think we have one last time to look at Ivan's follow-up. He says, if the best use of this approach is not to revisit what works well in classical science, perhaps it can be used to examine the parts of knowledge where classical science breaks down. I imagine that is why there was an openness to adopt a similar approach in quantum metaphysics. Primary area I can think of is consciousness. Classical science is struggling to explain consciousness, as we all know. Do you have thoughts on how relational metaphysics might introduce new insights into consciousness? That's the question. Please briefly respond to that question so that we can go to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much. As a token, when we declare that being is relationship, in essence, when we move from the substance metaphysical clarion of being qua being, studying being as being, to studying being as relationship, being qua relationship, we open doors to all kinds of possibilities. Okay, conscious experience, human conscious experience, either from a metaphysical, phenomenological point of view, or from the issues involving identity, or even AI, as the case may be, artificial intelligence, and whether it is conscious or it's ever going to be conscious, or concerning human beings as their conscious experience that has been studied in philosophy, in science, in neuroscience, and what have you. A relationship factors in. It factors in the relational point of view to however you want to distill the concept itself and the ideas associated with that. I think there's a room for consciousness, for relationality in all of that. It depends on which direction you want to spin it. Okay. I'm not sure that I have taken it to the direction you want. I'm not sure, but there's a room for relationality in everything. Okay, that is the idea of our fundamental statement of being studied as relationship. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Jonathan, for that. I think, I believe we have a Slack platform where more of these discussions can be had. And I join all of us to participate in that, and also enjoyments that may be directed to you about your lecture today and other things. All right, thank you very much, Prof, for that wonderful lecture, and thank you everyone for your questions and so on.
Thank you, everyone.